Well, welcome back to term. I hope you all had a good half-term break. I hope you spent some time thinking about your essay topics, titles. As I say, if you need to discuss any of that with me, please feel free to drop me an email or to have an appointment during office hours to discuss in detail, if you like, your ideas for your essay topic. Try to make, however, your ideas as specific as possible. In other words, you want to prepare an agenda for discussion, almost like a very rough planning structure for your essay. And don't just think of a good idea, think of something that is of great interest to you, but it's something which has not only seized your imagination, but has already seized your commitment to doing some reading and research about the topic. And think in terms of a question, what we would call a problematique, a question that's not easily answered and needs to be interrogated over an extended essay. So do start thinking about that. Do your best. And as I say, if you're having any trouble, please get in touch. This particular lecture is sort of like a halfway point, and it gears off the proposition that I made, and which one or two of you took up in an earlier lecture, that we tend to think in terms of rebellions and revolutions as embodying causes of which we approve. In other words, those perhaps rebellions, revolutions, of which we do not approve, like Nazi Germany, Hitler's rise to power. I gave also the example of the Khmer Rouge in Kampuchea. Those things were reluctant to give any kind of seal of approval, as if we had some kind of romanticized idea as to what rebellion, revolution meant. So those things are going to loom a little bit in this lecture, but also we're going to reflect back on some of the elements of the lectures that we covered in the first part of this course. We're going to take a slightly harder edge in the second part of this course, see whether or not Romanticism can survive, or whether or not hard men and hard women basically are running the world of rebellion today. But let's start with poetry. As I said in my very first lecture, you can't get rid of the idea, the practice of poetry in this course. And the shining example, of course, is the work of Shariati, the Iranian intellectual who went to Paris, was exposed to international currents of thought, but all the same used the poetry of famous writers like Rumi, like Hafez, people who expressed the antiquity and the depth of his own culture in the days of Persia, in the days when there was this kind of interlinkage throughout the Middle East, not only in terms of countries that appear hostile today, but in terms of curating the wisdom of the West. I think I've made the point that without the renaissance of the Middle East, during what we call the European Dark Ages, the thought of Aristotle, the thought of Plato might well have been lost. If you remember the film and the book, The Name of the Rose, the film starring the late Sean Connery, then what you had there was the search for the lost book of Aristotle on laughter. And that wasn't a joke on the part of Eco, the novelist who penned the original story of The Name of the Rose. It was an expression of a real fear that things would be lost in Europe during a time that we figuratively call the Dark Ages, but in many respects really was in terms of learning. It actually took the introduction of universities in Europe to break through a sloth of intellectual despond and begin once again to make Europe into an intellectual powerhouse in the world. But in Persia, that never left the scene, and the work of poets like Rumi being, as it were, reintroduced into debate in the mid-20th century by people like Ali Shariati suggested something very, very strange in terms of Western epistemology, and that is that you could complete a rational argument, not in terms of logic, and certainly not in terms of the English fixation at that point in time on analytical and linguistic philosophy. In other words, everything had to be analyzed in terms of the meaning and the grammatical structure of words. But using Rumi, completing and developing meaning by sweep, by broad images, by metaphor, by evocation. In other words, the uses of poetry became fundamental to Shariati's idea of philosophy and were fundamental in terms of his being able to express a spirituality. It was that kind of infusion that he hoped to bring to a redevelopment of rebellious thought, but intellectual thought in the Iran of the Shah. Now, he was unsuccessful, as we have discussed. He died before the revolution. He probably would have been shocked at the way his name has been used in vain by the regime of the Ayatollahs. But the point I wanted to make here was that he used established poetry. Even the Ayatollah Khomeini was a great fan of Rumi and Shariati. He himself tried to write poetry in the style of these great poets. But what if you do not have a written canon of great literature? What if in your rebellion you have to make it up yourself? Do the composition. Be both the prophet of rebellion but also the poet of rebellion. And this is what we were discussing in the career of the New Zealand Maori rebel, Te Kuti. He was able to use song and poetry, metaphor, as a means of catalyzing rebellion against the white settlers who were stealing land in New Zealand, or Aotearoa, as the Maoris called the country. Using this kind of evocation would not have been enough in itself. You have to have a subject matter for your poetry that anchors belief. So what Te Kuti did was to continue what had become a young but definite tradition of developing a syncretic belief, a Christianity that was married and integrated with traditional Maori thought, Maori belief, but taking in particular the Christian idea drawn largely from the Old Testament that there would be a chosen nation and identifying the Maori people with the Israelites when they were being redeemed from slavery in Egypt. Now, other people have used this kind of image, basically the idea of being held captive in Babylon, for instance. That was a great motif of reggae songs in the 1960s and 1970s. But Te Kuti used the image of redemption from Egypt and basically tried to establish the idea of the Maori people as the new Israelites, led by God, blessed by God, and destined by God to be successful. And this was the subject matter of his poetry. In other words, it was an evocation of a spiritual relationship, of a justice in heaven that would be visited upon the struggle of the Maori people. So can you create your own poetry? Yes, but it has to be tied to a belief system. And it helps if this belief system is expressed in an evocative manner. Thus, Te Kuti's writings assume a great deal of importance in New Zealand history. He was literate, he could write both in Maori and in English, and in a culture which had hitherto not been a literate culture, it was one without a written history. What this meant was the first expression of an identity, a belief system, and a sense of unique identity, a chosen by God identity, not unlike the mandate of heaven, not unlike being born under a star, that catalyzed, reinforced, and blessed the idea of rebellion. we're going to be looking at this across a number of problematic cases today. But don't forget, we've always somehow, almost unconsciously, gotten used to this idea. When we talked in our earlier lectures about liberation theology, for instance, we just assumed that, yes, of course, the radical priests, the worker priests, the peasant priests could use the Bible, could use the Christological example to justify, bring justice, bring a sense of God's orderly universe of justice to their outlook on why they needed to rise up. But it was married all the same with a fundamental critique of the world, the neo-Marxist idea of dependency theory, in which chains of escalating capital accumulation and deprivation of those who could not accumulate, who were often immiserated in the process of accumulation, basically marrying a spiritual template for rebellion with a material and global critique of materialism. It was actually an extraordinarily radical combination. So that what you had was something which was rebellious, particularly in Latin America, was certainly rebellious against the Vatican. Some of this, as I said, in the case of Canaan Banana in Zimbabwe, expressed the same kind of rebellion in southern Africa. But in terms of thought, what you had was something which was revolutionary. Marrying that kind of spiritual template with a profound material critique of world systems was a real breakthrough in terms of liberation theology. But you see, we're talking about things as syncretic. You don't just have to marry religions together. You can marry different styles of thought together, as occurred in liberation theology. There's also something else which I think we're not mindful of. And this might have been achieved by accident, but don't forget, most of the liberation theologians were working in Latin American countries, countries like Brazil that, for instance, spoke Portuguese, others spoke Spanish. What you had was the use of a language which was much more poetic, evocatively poetic than English. And in this, perhaps by accident more than design, they captured the speech of Christ, which was in Aramaic. And this is something which literalists, Christian literalists who follow the Bible in its English expression, fail to understand. And that is that Aramaic is an intensely poetic and metaphoric language. And almost certainly what we have in English translation, which lends itself to literalism, of course, is not quite the kind of expression that Christ was making. Capturing that in a Latin language might perhaps have been able to render the thought of Christ and the Christological example of Christ in a much more meaningful, evocative, and impactful way. But there again, you're talking about the poetic qualities of language. And that, married with a hard-edged neo-Marxist dependency theory on the other hand, proved to be a potent combination, as I said. The idea of syncretic thought behind rebellion was expressed, as I said, very, very briefly. And let me say a bit more about this. In China, in the Taiping Rebellion of 1850 to 1864, it was a huge rebellion. It left up to 2 million people dead in the wake of what was a failed rebellion. But I think I related the story of how the founder of the Taiping basically extrapolated forwards from a few pages of missionary pamphlet that he found in his hotel room, liked extremely the figure of Christ, imagined what the complete Christological example would be, declared himself inspired to adopt the persona of the brother of Christ, and essentially wrote an alternative Bible based on his imagination of what the Bible had to be like. In doing so, drawing from traditional Chinese thought about the mandate of heaven, but taking it further than Xin Ai'an's 13th century novel, All Men Are Brothers, or more commonly translated as The Water Margin, taking it forward not just to an equality of 108 men from all walks of life, but including the equality of women, with the proviso that if you pick up a sword to fight with the Taiping, you're equal. Anyone who risks their life is equal. And it was the first known example of mass gender equality, or being contingent on being prepared to fight, that was known in China. Now, this didn't come out of the blue. If you think about the Taiping as beginning its upsurge in 1850, what you had was the beginning of female suffrage in the Western world around about 1840. And in fact, there was an incident in America in 1840 where women, because they were women, were banned from attending an anti-slavery conference. I mean, it's very ironic when you think about it in those terms. Both are righteous or just causes, are they not? But the idea that women could be involved in a rebellion not just for their own sake, but for the sake of others, those not free by virtue of being bonded in slavery, that amalgam of just cause seemed to have infiltrated into the Taiping conception of how a just universe should be administered in terms of its treatment of all those who were prepared to fight for this just universe. In a way, although it failed, Chairman Mao referred to the Taiping but didn't dwell on it too much. He recognized it as the great antecedent. But he wanted a material, communist view and structure of society. And bringing in these spiritual elements was an ask too much, even though, as I said, in 1949, when he reviewed the march past of the victorious Red Army in Tiananmen Square, he responded by chanting in ancient shamanistic language and acceptance of the mandate of heaven. You can't escape completely the idea of spirituality, that somewhere up there, someone up there blesses you down there. And particularly in a Confucian universe, which is hierarchical as opposed to the more recent Western idea of a horizontal society, there has to be reference to up there. As I said, the Chinese word for the universe, Tianha, basically means heaven and earth, and heaven is up there and earth is down there. And it's a chain of benefaction down and worship up that links the two. Each is obligated to the other to continue the flow within this chain. So the idea of being blessed, the idea of receiving mandate was key, no matter how deeply or otherwise communist thought developed in the People's Republic of China. Some of this was absent in the Boxer uprising of the early years of the 20th century. The word Boxer was used by the Western imperial powers that occupied large cities, particularly on the coastline of China, but they also occupied Beijing, Peking, as it was then called, and huge militarized garrisons of European troops and troops drawn from other parts of European empires, like many Indian policemen in terms of the British possessions, for instance. What you had was a sense of powerlessness on the part of the emperor. There was certainly a great sense of frustration, denigration, deprivation, and humiliation on the part of ordinary people. After all, their country, their cities, and in those cities their attempts at modernity, they were being produced and seized. And of course the humiliation of the Opium Wars when Chinese forces were defeated so comprehensively by Western forces so that the sale of opium could be forced upon the Chinese people, basically trying to turn an entire nation into drug addicts for the mercantile and economic benefit of a country like Great Britain, for instance. That humiliation of being treated in that subhuman way really rankled very, very deeply. But the emperor was powerless, did not dare deploy his military against the imperial militaries. They would have been defeated. The militaries of the European powers would then have turned against him. So the Boxer Uprising, although it attracted a very great deal of popular sympathy and support, was in fact a covert operation on the part of the emperor's operatives to try to foment what seemed like a popular uprising, but which was in fact an uprising which was an instrument of the otherwise powerless hand of the emperor and his administration in the forbidden city of Peking. It failed, but the use of magic was very, very key here. Not unlike other rebellions. For instance, I did mention that in the Mari rebellion, particularly in terms of the Hao Hao faction of the Paimeriri church, a syncretic church, the warriors were given blessings and they were immersed in ritual that was meant to confer an invulnerability upon them. The European bullets would not kill them. Of course, they did. But this idea lingered so that the Boxers threw themselves into battle, often armed only with swords and spears against imperial machine guns, and of course were basically butchered. This didn't stop wave upon wave of them trying, and it's certainly true they conducted a lot of atrocities along the way, particularly against Christian missionaries. In other words, this foreign thought that tried to legitimize imperial occupation. But it was an attempt to reassert not only some sense of Chinese independence, even though it was covertly organized by the emperor, but it was also meant to reassert, albeit in condensed and to a slight extent reinvented fashion, the values and the hope for triumph of Chinese culture, because the rituals in which the Boxers were immersed were rituals drawn, supposedly, from mystical Chinese times. We would call the Boxers Kung Fu fighters today. As I said, Boxers was an imperial appellation to try to describe these strange fighting systems being deployed against them by the rebels. So what you had were attempts to bring together cultures or different time periods of the same culture. Now, where this strikes us as particularly modern and in a way that we've been able to romanticize is in the case of the Indian rebellion against British rule, led by Gandhi, who had spent much time at the turn of the 20th century in South Africa. He was in South Africa for a number of years. He left a mixed reputation there. Apparently, he was extremely open to people of all races, with the exception, it seems, of the black majority. Even so, he had a huge impact upon the leaders of the black majority. As I said, Govan Mbeki, the father of Thabo and Maletsi Mbeki, had a picture of Marx and a picture of Gandhi on his mantelpiece at home. Moletsi, the younger brother of Thabo Mbeki, related this story to me. They regarded these two as the great founding fathers of both thought and revolution of the 20th century. Kenneth Kaunda, who became the founding president of Zambia, we'll be discussing him in a few minutes, also relied heavily on the thought of Gandhi. But to what extent was this thought really expressive, as we've come to believe, of Indian culture? To what extent did it manipulate and use Indian culture? To what extent was it, in fact, a conflation of different views drawn from many different cultures? It was well known, for instance, that Gandhi was a great admirer of Tolstoy, of Thoreau, and their ideas, both of them, of an Arcadian paradise, which was the destiny of any kind of successful rebellion, that humanity would be able to live as one, once again, with nature. There's only a brief shortcut between that and living as one with the universe, with the spiritual universe, with the balance of forces, both of the spirit and of nature. And finding that and using that kind of aspiration in a backdrop of Indian mysticism was something that Gandhi was very, very adept at using. The use of the term satyagraha, meaning basically the curating, the development of truth, established a link for Gandhi between what he was trying to do in a modern era underneath modern colonialism. Don't forget the 1940s was the time of modernity, particularly as we were emerging from World War II, in which, of course, modernity had taken huge steps forward, chiefly because of the need to develop more destructive engines of war. We were in the atomic age by then, fighting against the forces of modernity, which had been greatly enhanced because of war which had involved India. Indian troops fought for the British basically for two reasons, both because they didn't want to be colonized by the Japanese, who'd made great incursions into Burma, then part of the British Raj. The Japanese established a puppet government that claimed to be the government of India with an Indian leader. And secondly, they fought because if we fight now on behalf of the British, they're the colonizing power. This gives us a negotiating position after the war is over for the sake of independence. So India was part of a huge effort against international fascism. And this meant that when Gandhi began his major uprising, basically in the 1940s, the British really had to take note, not only because of the power of the uprising, but because of debt owed. So you had a sense very, very much that if they're using also instruments to do with spirituality, to do with mysticism, you had a sense of if you tried to crush this, you were crushing something holy. And Gandhi used this image in the West, particularly in Great Britain, to huge effect. His constant wearing of the dhoti, traditional clothes, the loincloth and sash, his depiction of himself as a guileless peasant, did not hide at all really how guileful he was in his use of theatre. Sudipta Kaviraj, who used to be my colleague here at SOAS, now at Columbia University, wrote very, very evocatively about Gandhi's use of theatrical presentation in his defense when he was brought on trial before the British. But this sense of theatre loomed large in terms of his international depiction. How could the British bully such a person? While all the same, he was surrounded by such hard-edged modern intellectual figures like Nehru, like somebody whom I greatly admired when I was young, Krishna Menon, who became the first foreign minister of an independent India. Gandhi was at all times not just the simple holy man who span cloth at his spinning wheel, and of course that spinning wheel still features as a central emblem on the Indian flag. He was a very, very canny person who also made miscalculations, particularly in terms, for instance, of allowing Islamic dissatisfaction with developments in the independence process in India to spiral into a demand for separate independence, the bloodshed of partition that followed, and of course Gandhi's own assassination as a result of the upheavals of that point in time. But as I said last week, there are other questions you need to ask of Gandhi as well. In other words, questions of his cynicism, not just of his syncretism. But if you're sending your followers out on the understanding that you're going to have civil disobedience against a militarized force and you're not going to fight, it's going to be pacific, and you know that the British are prepared to gun you down, and they did, to what extent are you knowingly sending your people out to their deaths? Is this holy? Was this a sacrifice worth making? In other words, something justified in terms of results rather than fully wrapped in the mantle of justice? So these are questions to ask about probably the most successful presentation of spiritually imbued rebellion that the world of the 20th century was able to encounter. It echoed throughout other countries. As I said, what you had in southern Africa was the example of Gandhi, influenced the Mbeki family, influenced, as I said, Thabo Mbeki, not just in terms of the pacific nature, the declared pacific nature of Gandhi's rebellion. Certainly in terms of, look, they're fighting for their own culture. We also have a culture to fight for, even though there had been huge missionary inroads and huge missionary influence in southern Africa by then. And Zambia today is constitutionally a Christian state, for instance. Although there's much syncretic religion there, many of them embodying traditional forms of worship, but all the same, within a very discernible Christian context, it's still the Bible, no matter how interpreted and no matter how overlaid with other influences. And indeed, one of the very first rebellions that Kaunda himself faced was that of a prophetess from a syncretic religion. We'll come to that in just a minute. We are going to deal a little bit with Kaunda as opposed to what happened in South Africa, for the simple reason that in South Africa, modernity had a much greater influence than in Zambia. Zambia, together with Malawi, its next door neighbor towards its northeast, were the poor parts of the Confederation of the Rhodesias and Nyasaland, as Malawi was then called. The rich part was southern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe now, and its relationship with South Africa, not part of the Confederation, but a very, very close support relationship between the white minority governments of those two countries. And what you had, particularly in South Africa itself and emanating as far as Zimbabwe, was this sense of modern development founded on two things: huge mineral resources, and Zambia, northern Rhodesia also had mineral resources, but a white population which was technically and technologically adept at exploiting these mineral resources within a mass of white settlement, because in both countries there were also farmlands. So you were able to have a mixed community that was able to feed itself, be dependent only upon itself, to develop modern instruments of production, to have a proper material culture in the modern sense. That was not apparent further north in a place that we now call Zambia. There were some white farmers there, very much a minority. There was certainly an attempt to develop the copper mines of Zambia, and at the time of independence, copper was and remains to this day, worryingly, the mono commodity, the major source of economic income for Zambia. But all the same, it was not to the same degree as, for instance, in the gold mining of South Africa. The gold mining that built the incredible city of Johannesburg, for instance, one of the great cities of the world, one of the great financial centers of the world. And that was not possible further north. When you get to Lusaka, the capital of Zambia, it wasn't a one-horse town, it was a three-street town. Cairo Road, the main road, was flanked on one side by two other roads, and they went in a straight line. They met at a roundabout that fed into the Great North Road that was meant eventually, underneath the design of Cecil Rhodes, to reach Cairo, the Cape to Cairo Road, which didn't get much further than Zambia. But there was nothing there. It was completely underdeveloped. So what you had with Kaunda was a sense of not working his rebellion in terms of a modernity, but a huge desire, as soon as independence was achieved, to reach a modernity, which was thwarted at the outset, just 1 year after Zambian independence in 1964, by the unilateral declaration of white settlers in southern Rhodesia, 1965, never to accept majority rule. And of course, war began. Zambian exports and imports were dependent on the roads and railways linking north to south, going through white-ruled territory built by Cecil Rhodes. Basically, Kaunda had to invent a resistance that was pacific. He would have been beaten a dime to a dozen if he tried to deploy his very young, very meager military forces. And somehow, to be pacific, take the hits. There were many such hits. And at the same time, give safe haven to rebel groups from South Africa and from Zimbabwe, without giving them military support, allowing them to receive military aid from China and the Soviet Union. At the same time, try to develop his country, try to unite 72 different ethnic groups with 72 different languages. At one stage, I counted slightly more than that. It could reach as high as 84, depending on how you differentiate language and dialect. But the linguists have settled on the figure of 72 discrete languages. There are loan words, of course, across some of these languages, just like we use French words in English, etc., etc. But discrete, separate languages. Now, the idea of Pacific rebellion occurred to him in terms of his own liberation struggle before independence in 1964. He didn't have the forces to fight the British occupiers. The supporters sometimes threw stones in the street, but there was never any militarized, there was never any armed war of liberation, as in other places in southern Africa. And he basically had to justify this in terms of we are being Pacific because of doctrine which is Christian, it's a Pacific religion, which echoes the pacifism of Gandhi, whose works he came to know when he was on the run from the British. And the one place the British thought he could never be when they were hunting him down was among the Indian community, the descendants of indentured labor to Zambia, because there was meant to be bad blood between Indian people and black African people. But the Indian community took in Kenneth Kaunda, hid him, literally sometimes hiding under beds as British patrols went by. But the British never thought seriously that's where he would be hiding. Well, when you're lying underneath the bed for hours at a time, and someone shoves underneath the bed reading material for you, and they're the writings of Gandhi, you're going to read them. And they had a huge influence on Kaunda. I think he really was able to marry them to a Christian belief which was very profound in terms of a just cause, and not unlike the Israelites being released from Egypt, but a just cause leading to heavenly redemption, heavenly blessing. A just cause which meant standing up to white settlerdom and white rebel regimes also claiming to be Christian, needing to be more Christian than they in terms of the Christological example of turning the other cheek when someone strikes you. As I said, that featured in the Zoroastrian text against the Roman Empire. Christ taught you to turn the other cheek. but at the same time not lose face in terms of total military capitulation. And indeed, his own Air Force commander, a gentleman whom I knew well, General Hanana Lumbu, one day got so frustrated at constant Rhodesian Air Force raids where the Rhodesian pilots would taunt the Zambian Air Force parked on the ground underneath orders from Kaunda not to take off, that General Lungu defied his own president, took off and crossed the border unspotted by Rhodesian radar and dropped smoke bombs the length of the Rhodesian main military runway, made it home safely, very, very much as a signal, look, we could do this if we were allowed to. Kaunda promoted the young man, that's how he got his generalship, and Han and I could never tell that story without laughing his head off. Of course, it was a huge risk. He was, in fact, a totally expert pilot, someone who would astound and terrify people who were selling warplanes at military air shows by demanding to test fly the latest fighter pilots himself. So that kind of character lent, in the end, a legendary patina to a Pacific rebellion that had to take many military blows. All the same came through as a fight for freedom underneath the guise of principle, but with the odd spark of actual occasional military dissidence and fight back. But the first fight back of Kota had to be against one of his own people. As I said, this was a prophetess. It came just before independence. Alice Lenshina, the leader of the Lumpa Church, a syncretic church in which he designated herself after a vision, not only as a prophetess, but as the righteous inheritor of Christ and his kingdom, which had to be instigated upon earth in a way that Kaunda was not managing to do. You might call this a fundamentalist vision. It was certainly a vision that came in the delirium of cerebral malaria, that's malaria of the brain. When you get malaria, you hope like crazy it's not cerebral malaria, because recovery from that can be extraordinarily problematic. In her delirium, and basically all malaria makes you delirious in any case, she had this vision of herself as the chosen of Christ. And her rebellion basically had to be put down by Kaunda quite ruthlessly. The ruthlessness of it all by military means is still a subject of controversy in Zambia to this day, and suggests to me that, as in the case of Gandhi, all the protestations of pacifism were as much pragmatic as principled. It was pragmatic successfully in terms of standing up to the white Rhodesian regime and to the apartheid regime of South Africa, but when needs must for the sake of national unity, then military force was something that he was prepared to deploy. So you had contradictions, and these contradictions remain, as it were, subjects of great debate in Zambian political history to this day. It's problematic, in other words. Something that is, however, more problematic, and I want to spend the last 15-20 minutes on this, is the case of Uganda. The case of Joseph Kony, who last week, or basically by the time you listened to this lecture 10 days ago, offered finally to surrender. Supposedly, we don't know whether or not this is simply propaganda that President Museveni is using in terms of his bid for yet another re-election. But anyway, the news reports suggest that this may be a genuine offer of surrender, which Museveni could well accept, because quite apart from all of the reports of atrocity which Museveni used to his great advantage, the atrocities that Kony was meant to have perpetrated, the rebellion of Kony was also extremely useful to Museveni, because he was able to use this as a reason for constantly approaching Western powers for greater military assistance, particularly by way of equipment to his own army. You've got a very well-equipped Ugandan army these days. And somehow they never managed to capture Coney. Now, Uganda's a big country. I know this from having trekked all over it, top to bottom. And it's easy to lose track of an army which at its maximum, largely of very young recruits, including many child soldiers, was probably only about 3,000. 5,000 at the maximal estimate, particularly as the child soldiers grew into an adult fighting force that was actually quite adept, apparently, as a fighting force. But if it had reached 5,000, then satellite technology would have tracked down a force of that size, which was constantly on the move. You could have tracked its location, you could have tracked its movements. They moved as a unit, and it's like a small nation constantly on the move to elude capture, committing atrocities and depredations along the way, although not always in the way that the Western media has portrayed it. Certainly some of these portrayals were real, but and I think I've cited for you on the BLE pages, and I might read an excerpt from some of this to you when we have our seminar, our class. Some families sent their children to Joseph Kony because they could get a form of education while marching with the soldiers of his rebellion. That rebellion began underneath another prophetess, someone else called Alice Lakwena, who was described by some as a witch, by Heike Behrendt, the esteemed Netherlandish scholar, as a kind of shaman figure who all the same was essentially Christian. But she was possessed like Joan of Arc was possessed. She heard spirits in her head. One of these spirits was Qing Po, a Chinese survivor in spirit form from the Boxer Uprising at the gates of Beijing. And apparently it was Qing Po who taught Alice Lakwena's soldiers the rituals and the arts of invulnerability, which at the Great Battle of Jinja, as in the Great Battle of Beijing, didn't actually work. But what you had was the spiritual foundation for an uprising against the newly installed Museveni, who had won power by force in the wake of the chaos that came after the downfall of Idi Amin and fragile successor regime after fragile successor regime finally gave way to the forces of Museveni, who had mobilized in the Ruwenzori Mountains in the northwest part of Uganda near the Zaire or Congolese border, the Ruwenzori Mountains, the so-called Mountains of the Moon, spiritual mountains, and took upon themselves the spiritual mandate to liberate Uganda from years of complete chaos. Using child soldiers who were very often the orphans of families who had been massacred by Amin. And they, by their own testimony, often fought for the sake of revenge, although their officers who were adult often used them as cannon fodder. Of course, they were the front line, and they probably were the front line in the Great Battle of Jinja against the forces of Alice Lakwena, who were drawn from the Acholi people. So Alice rose up on behalf of the Acholi people, their spiritual beliefs, and their regional autonomy that they thought would be imperiled by Museveni. Huge spiritual forces of a cosmopolitan nature were invoked by Alice. Congolese spirits were in her head, her high command, which lived in her head. Lakwena is a name that comes from an Italian explosives engineer. And of course, Qing Po, the survivor of the Boxer Uprising, was also in her head. A Joan of Arc type of figure. And knowing the sway that she held over her followers and the Acholi nation in general, Museveni let her escape after his victory at the Battle of Jinja. It would have been strange, however, if Museveni had been defeated at Jinja. Those of you who have been to Uganda will know there's a straight line between Jinja and Kampala, the capital city. Museveni threw all of his forces into this battle, child soldiers and all. If he'd been defeated, would the world have had its first, to use the parlance of that day, its first witch president? What ideas would Alice have brought into international relations at that point in time? Despite being a peasant woman, she led a movement called the Holy Spirit Movement, Holy Spirit Army. She wrote a battle manual. She wrote a health and safety manual. All of these things were propagated to her soldiers, who all the same went into the Battle of Jinja underarmed, carrying wire models of fighter aircraft, and their chanting was meant to turn these wire models into the real thing. It was a magical rebellion in more ways than one, drawn from a conflation of spiritual imagery, spiritual beliefs, of the most syncretic and also cosmopolitan sort. In other words, like the Taiping reaching out to what was then emerging as a Western feminism, Alice reached out to a world of influences, rebellions from as far away as China. Simple-minded these things were not. And Coney himself, as the self-designated successor, in fact, I think that Coney is in fact the nephew of Alice Lakwena, Coney also tries to invoke this kind of cosmopolitanism and multi-spiritual foundation blessing. He is meant to be a proponent of 13 religions, including the great world religions of Christianity, Judaism, Islam. He celebrates all of their rituals. He claims the Holy Spirit comes to instruct him to maintain his rebellion, that it is just for two reasons. First of all, on behalf of the Acholi people, who also need to be saved, as the Israelites were saved from bondage in Egypt. But also, his rebellion is just, and he's informed and guaranteed this by the Holy Spirit, because Museveni has been ruining Uganda. That's a slightly more difficult claim to sustain. Many people would certainly suggest that Museveni has become quite intolerant in his old age and has been in power for far too many terms, but there's been great development in Uganda underneath his presidencies. The fact that he's challenged at these elections by a young musician, Bobby Wine, does suggest, however, that a younger generation with more modern ideas might wish to have its turn in power. All the same, if Joseph Kony does finally surrender, would be a huge propaganda coup for Museveni as he enters his election. Will we see the end of that particular rebellion? How will people write about it when we have more testimony from the point of view of Kony and his direct lieutenants? Now, one of my great regrets at SOAS was that the colonel who led the manhunt for Kony, the Ugandan colonel, was meant to come to me as my PhD student, who'd been communicating for quite a long time. Somehow his scholarship got sidetracked to a South African university. I'm sure there were all kinds of forces at play there, so he wouldn't tell his story to too much of a metropolitan audience. But it would have been very, very interesting to have had discussions with this colonel who was in the front line and basically to ask him the question, why could you never capture Kony? Were you under instructions perhaps never to look too hard? Or was he really that elusive? Now, in fact, some years ago, he had retreated from Uganda. He was meant to be either in parts of Congo or in parts of South Sudan, on the cusp of South Sudan's independence, 2010. I wandered all over the area of South Sudan where he was meant to be, and there's not a trace anywhere either of several thousand young soldiers marching, or any kind of report on the part of villagers who would have been able to spot such a force tramping all over their soil. So the whereabouts and the wanderings of Coney, that is something which remains almost as it were part of the stuff of legend. One part of the legend was that in the days when the American government was meant to be having sanctions against Khartoum, Sudan, uh, underneath Bashir, a joint force of Sudanese commandos and American commandos were meant to have been on the verge of capturing Coney, and somehow Coney managed to slip through their hands. The Americans say largely because of the incompetence of the command of the Sudanese side of the operation, but we don't know the answer to that. This is meant to be a covert operation. Or maybe Coney was just a good general. That we shall have to wait for the fullness of time to reveal. He's been indicted by the International Criminal Court. And of course, will he be brought to justice? Is there going to be a clemency deal? All kinds of questions to be asked about this rebellion. But the question I posed at the very beginning, we're very reluctant to give the accolade of justice to a rebellion like his. We're very reluctant to give the accolade of rebellion to the white settler rebellion against majority rule in Rhodesia in the days before it became Zimbabwe. We would be very, very reluctant to give the accolade of just rebellion to Aldous Lanshina against Kaunda and his noble ambitions for a unified Zambia of 72 different ethnicities. At the beginning of the independence period in Zambia, we would be most reluctant to say that aspects of Gandhi's rebellion against the British, particularly in his conduct of rebellion, sending innocent people to their deaths knowingly, would we say that that was unjust? And most of us would find it very difficult to say that. So what I've tried to do today is to give some sense of problematizing rebellion. One thing that does come through, however, is that in almost all the cases that we've discussed, in fact, indeed, in all of them, you've got this sense of an amalgamation of belief, cross currents, different international flows of belief. Nothing is simple and native anymore, if ever it was. As soon as you're fighting against a metropolitan power, you're immediately cosmopolitan. You need to use the weapons of the colonizer against the colonizer. You're drawing from the wider world. And as I say, when you look at the lieutenants of Gandhi, people like Nehru, people like Krishna Menon, you're looking at terrifyingly well-educated people in the Western sense. I mean, Krishna Menon was meant to have been one of the star masters students at LSE down the road from us. Star. His professors couldn't say enough that was good about him and his intellect. A brilliant foreign minister during the time when India wanted also to become an atomic power. So you had all kinds of contradictions in all this. How do you relate within your cosmopolitan influences and all the same prioritize an authentic cultural spirituality? How do you locate a modernity that all the same has to be pragmatic in terms of making dramatic and terrible decisions over things like, are you going to develop the atomic bomb? Are you going to do that because you think balance of power in the region, not only against Pakistani efforts to do the same, but against China, are just? Is there a Cold War militarized justice which cannot be expressed in terms of spiritual belief? Or could it be an expression itself of the words of the gods, where Shiva is meant to say that he can cause the destruction of the world with an energy brighter than 1,000 suns? And this idea of a meeting place, a dramatic meeting place, often a violent meeting place between what went before, the mixtures of the present moment of rebellion and an aspiration for what lies ahead, these are things that, quite apart from belief systems, these are things in terms of timelines that give a dimension to the underpinning thought on the just rebellion. So thank you very, very much, ladies and gentlemen.